Eastern Europe, 1942. The dawn broke cold and gray, the mist clinging to the forested hills that bordered the small village of Dubrava. The village, like countless others in the region, had been swept up in the machinery of war. German soldiers occupied the streets, rounding up villagers under suspicion of aiding partisan fighters. Orders had arrived from higher command: execute all male residents of the village and transport the women and children for forced labor. The directive was clear. The method was brutal. Among the soldiers assigned to carry out the orders was Unteroffizier Karl Reinhardt, a man of 29, who had enlisted in the Wehrmacht years earlier out of a sense of duty and patriotism. Yet Karl had witnessed horrors on the Eastern Front that shook his understanding of obedience. Villages burned, families slaughtered, and civilians humiliated under the pretext of military necessity. Each atrocity weighed heavily on his conscience. Karl was not alone in his moral struggle. Within his unit, a few men quietly questioned the orders they were given. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Brandt, a skilled marksman, had grown increasingly uneasy with the violent enforcement of command. Private Dieter Fischer, barely 20, had enlisted to escape poverty, but his experiences had awakened a moral awareness he could not ignore. Together with Karl, they formed an unspoken pact. They would refuse to carry out mass murder, no matter the consequences. The morning's operation was carefully orchestrated. Officers shouted orders, detailing which houses to search, which men to gather, and where to position the firing squads. The unit marched through the village, rifles at the ready, yet Karl and his small group moved with a different purpose. They were determined to subvert the orders without exposing themselves to immediate punishment. The risk was immense. Execution for insubordination was a reality they understood. Karl's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a family huddled in the corner of a barn, eyes wide with terror. The father, a man of 35, clutched his youngest child to his chest while the mother shielded her older children. Karl's hands tightened on his rifle. He had been trained to obey, yet obedience now demanded complicity in atrocity. He leaned toward Heinrich and whispered, "We cannot do this. We have to find a way out." Heinrich nodded subtly. "We act carefully, follow appearances, but we refuse to fire. We do not kill them." The first challenge presented itself when the village priest approached, pleading for the safety of his congregation. Officers dismissed him, barking orders for immediate execution. Karl's chest tightened. His heart pounded in his ears as he glanced at Fischer, whose youthful face was pale with fear. They shared a look of understanding. They would not participate in mass murder. The soldiers assigned to the firing squads raised their rifles. Karl, Heinrich, and Fischer followed the motions, positioning themselves precisely, mimicking obedience. Each man understood that hesitation or deviation could lead to immediate death. Yet their rifles would not discharge. Karl had subtly misaligned the firing pins the night before, a small act of sabotage that could save lives. Heinrich and Fischer had done the same. The moment of reckoning arrived. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Weber, barked the command to fire. Karl's finger rested lightly on the trigger. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then, at the signal, the rifles were raised, but the bullets remained harmlessly lodged in the mechanisms. No shots rang out. The villagers, sensing hesitation, glanced around in confusion. The illusion of obedience remained perfect to the officers, but no one was harmed. Chaos rippled through the village as the prisoners seized the opportunity to flee. Karl and his comrades provided subtle cover, ensuring that as many as possible escaped into the surrounding woods. The officers were temporarily distracted by the confusion, giving the men a slim window to maintain the facade of obedience while protecting life. By the time the firing squad would have delivered its deadly volley, the villagers had slipped into the forest. The operation, which on paper appeared successful to higher command, had been secretly subverted. Karl exhaled slowly, relief mingled with fear. Every successful act of defiance increased the risk of exposure. Every survival depended on absolute secrecy. The days following the operation were tense. Officers questioned minor irregularities, suspicious of repeated misfires and anomalies in reports. Karl and his companions had to maintain the appearance of strict obedience while continuing to orchestrate subtle interventions. The psychological burden was immense. Each man wrestled with fear, conscience, and the knowledge that a single mistake could lead to execution for all involved. Karl often reflected on the paradox of their situation. They were soldiers in the Wehrmacht, a machine designed to impose obedience and terror, yet they had become protectors of life. Their acts of defiance were small, discreet, and dangerous, but they carried profound moral significance. Each life saved was a quiet rebellion against the machinery of destruction. The next assignment was no less perilous. Intelligence reported a neighboring village had sheltered partisans, prompting orders for a similar mass execution. Karl's network convened in secret to plan their intervention. They identified escape routes, coordinated with sympathetic villagers, and prepared contingency measures to prevent casualties. Every step required precision, timing, and unwavering trust. When the platoon arrived, Karl's heart pounded. The village was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Civilians peeked from behind shuttered windows, aware that the soldiers carried death in their hands. Karl and Heinrich exchanged subtle signals. Fischer, despite his fear, understood the plan. They would follow the motions of obedience while preventing the killings. The officers began rounding up villagers, shouting orders and calling out names. Karl's group moved with calculated precision, positioning themselves to allow escape. A child ran into the street, and Karl caught him, guiding him to a safe hiding place. Heinrich and Fischer helped others slip into concealed paths, ensuring that families could reunite if they reached safety. The commanding officer grew impatient. Lieutenant Weber, already suspicious from prior errors, scrutinized every action. Karl's pulse raced, but he maintained composure. He offered plausible explanations for minor delays, directing attention away from the escape routes and the subtle sabotage he had implemented in the rifles and logistics. The tension was nearly unbearable, yet their performance remained flawless. By the time the operation concluded, nearly all villagers had survived. Reports submitted to higher command indicated compliance, yet the reality was a series of quiet, deliberate acts of moral courage. Karl and his companions allowed themselves a brief moment of relief, but the danger was ever present. Each new order brought the potential for exposure. Over the following weeks, the network grew in confidence but also in caution. They refined signals, developed more sophisticated sabotage techniques, and coordinated closely with villagers and sympathetic civilians. The psychological strain remained intense. Karl often lay awake at night, replaying operations, imagining worst-case scenarios, and questioning the adequacy of their interventions. Their defiance, however, inspired others. Quiet acts of moral courage began to ripple through the platoon. Soldiers who had previously followed orders without question began to hesitate at the sight of civilians, subtly aiding escapes or delaying executions. The network's influence was growing, though still hidden beneath layers of obedience. Winter approached, bringing with it new challenges. Orders became harsher, executions more frequent, and officer inspections more stringent. Karl's group had to adapt constantly, anticipating scrutiny and developing contingency plans. Each act of defiance required more ingenuity and greater risk. The moral stakes had never been higher. One night, Karl received intelligence that a detachment of prisoners was scheduled for immediate execution at a nearby clearing. The group convened to plan the operation. Escape routes were mapped, distractions arranged, and civilians instructed in secret to flee to safety. The plan required split-second timing and perfect coordination. Failure would result in death for the prisoners and likely for Karl and his comrades. The morning of the operation arrived. Karl, Heinrich, and Fischer positioned themselves strategically. Officers barked orders, demanding compliance and speed. The rifles were raised, motions precise, yet the bullets remained harmlessly lodged. Karl's heart pounded in his chest as he signaled subtle directions to facilitate escapes. Families moved quietly into the forest, guided by the network's careful planning. Lieutenant Weber, observing closely, began to suspect irregularities. Minor delays, unusual behavior, and the survival of prisoners raised questions. Karl's group maintained composure, providing plausible explanations while protecting the fleeing civilians. The illusion of obedience remained intact, even under intense scrutiny. By the time the officers departed, the clearing was empty of casualties. Karl exhaled slowly, relief mixed with lingering fear. The network had succeeded, saving lives once again. Yet the psychological toll weighed heavily. Bauer, Fischer, and Heinrich understood that each operation was a balance between moral courage and mortal risk. The cost of discovery could be fatal, but the cost of inaction, witnessing mass murder, was unthinkable. Over the winter months, the network continued its work, navigating increasingly complex orders, higher scrutiny, and growing danger. They saved lives, coordinated with villagers, and subtly influenced fellow soldiers to act with conscience. Each act of defiance, though invisible to higher command, represented a profound moral victory. Karl often reflected on the paradox of their existence. They wore the uniform of oppressors, yet acted as protectors. They followed orders in form, while subverting them in spirit. Each day presented new opportunities to assert humanity in the midst of brutality. And though the war raged on, the network understood that moral courage could endure, even in the darkest circumstances. By the end of the winter, the village of Dubrava remained largely intact, its people alive and hope quietly preserved. Karl, Heinrich, and Fischer had learned that walking away from mass murder did not mean abandoning duty. It meant redefining duty through the lens of conscience. They had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly, even when consequences were dire. Winter deepened in 1943, blanketing Eastern Europe in a harsh, gray cold. Snow-laden forests surrounded the small villages where Karl Reinhardt and his network of conscience had quietly thwarted repeated orders to execute civilians. Despite their previous successes, the danger now felt closer than ever. Officer inspections were more frequent, punishments for hesitation harsher, and rumors of misfires had reached the ears of higher command. Karl convened his small circle. Oberstfreiter Heinrich Brandt and Private Dieter Fischer, along with Franz, a young medic who had discreetly joined their network. They met in a dilapidated barn outside the village, a place that had become their planning ground for months. "We have no margin for error anymore," Karl said quietly. "Every officer is watching, and our past successes make us suspect. We must act with more caution than ever, but we cannot abandon the villagers. Lives depend on us." Heinrich nodded. "We've learned to be invisible, to work within the machinery while subverting it. But now, even minor mistakes could expose us. We need contingency plans for everything: convoys, patrols, inspections. Every scenario must be accounted for." Fischer's voice trembled slightly. "How many more times can we do this? How many more lives will be at risk? I don't know if I can endure another near failure." Karl placed a firm hand on Fischer's shoulder. "We endure because conscience demands it. Every life saved matters. That is our purpose. We are not soldiers merely obeying orders. We are men preserving humanity." The first mission of the winter came quickly. Intelligence reported that a small village on the outskirts of their sector had been identified as a hub of partisan support. The orders were brutal. All adult males were to be executed, women and children deported to labor camps. The operation was to be carried out immediately, with oversight from Hauptmann Weber, whose suspicion of Karl's platoon had grown significantly. Karl and his team began planning meticulously. They mapped hidden paths through forests, coordinated with sympathetic villagers for temporary hiding spots, and identified potential distractions to divert officer attention. The plan required precise timing and flawless coordination. Each member had a critical role. Karl would oversee the operation and manage appearances, Heinrich would guide civilians to safety, Fischer would coordinate misdirections, and Franz would provide medical cover. On the morning of the operation, snow blanketed the village, muting the sounds of approaching boots. Officers barked orders as villagers were rounded up, their eyes wide with fear. Karl's chest tightened. He had participated in similar operations before, yet the stakes felt higher now. Any error could lead to mass death and expose their network. The firing squad was prepared. Soldiers assumed positions, rifles at the ready. Karl subtly signaled Heinrich and Fischer. Each man understood. The rifles would never discharge at the villagers. The officers were close, scrutinizing every action. The tension was suffocating. At the signal, rifles were raised. Karl's finger hovered over the trigger, yet the mechanisms had been subtly sabotaged in advance. Heinrich and Fischer mirrored him. A tense silence filled the air as the officers gave the command to fire. The illusion of obedience remained intact, yet no shots rang out. Chaos erupted in the freezing air. Villagers, sensing hesitation, seized the moment to flee. Karl and his companions guided them toward hidden paths, through dense woods and across frozen streams. Franz attended to those who stumbled in the snow, masking injuries as accidents caused by terrain. By the time the officers realized something had gone wrong, the villagers were mostly safe. The operation, though technically successful on paper, left Karl and his network on edge. Weber's suspicion was now more pronounced. Minor inconsistencies in reports, combined with repeated misfires, threatened to draw scrutiny from even higher command. Karl understood that future operations would be increasingly dangerous. In the following weeks, the network refined its tactics. They developed coded signals for emergencies, rehearsed contingency plans, and created distractions during inspections. Each mission required absolute trust, precise execution, and careful deception. The psychological toll was immense, but the moral imperative drove them onward. One particularly challenging operation involved a convoy of prisoners being transported to a labor camp. Karl's team identified a critical point along the route, a narrow pass through the forest where escape could be facilitated. Heinrich and Fischer positioned themselves strategically, ready to guide civilians into concealed paths. Franz prepared to tend to the wounded, ensuring that minor injuries would appear accidental. As the convoy approached, Karl signaled the operation to begin. Soldiers moved with practiced precision, following orders as if unaware of the moral imperative guiding Karl's network. The prisoners, mostly men and teenagers, were tense, aware of the risk. At the critical point, subtle diversions, a fallen branch, a misdirected officer, created an opening. Civilians slipped into the forest under the network's guidance, disappearing into the safety of hidden paths. The officer supervising the convoy grew suspicious, but Karl's calm demeanor, combined with the plausible explanations of minor delays and accidents, kept him at bay. By the time the convoy reached the camp, several prisoners had vanished into the woods, their lives spared. The success was a testament to careful planning and moral courage, yet the danger of discovery remained ever present. Winter brought yet another test. Reports arrived that a neighboring village had been accused of harboring partisans, and a mass execution was ordered. This time, the operation was to be overseen by Oberleutnant Richter, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail and suspicion of any irregularities. Karl knew that conventional deception might not suffice. The network had to create a multi-layered plan to ensure survival. They devised a strategy involving staged distractions, misinformation, and coordinated civilian guidance. Paths were mapped in advance, temporary shelters prepared, and diversions arranged to draw officer attention away from key areas. Every member of the network had a precise role, rehearsed repeatedly to minimize error. The morning of the operation was tense. Snow and mist cloaked the village, making movement silent and careful. Civilians huddled in barns and behind fences, guided by Karl's signals. Officers barked orders, demanding obedience and speed. The network executed the plan flawlessly. Rifles were raised, motions precise, yet bullets remained harmlessly lodged. Civilians slipped into forests and concealed paths under the guidance of Heinrich and Fischer. Franz tended to the injured, masking accidents as terrain-related mishaps. Oberleutnant Richter observed closely, noting minor irregularities, yet plausible explanations allowed the network to maintain the illusion of obedience. By the end of the operation, the majority of villagers had survived. Karl's network had once again successfully intervened, preserving life while navigating extreme danger. Yet the psychological strain was heavier than ever. Each operation demanded precision, courage, and the willingness to risk death for the sake of conscience. As winter progressed, Karl reflected on the paradox of their existence. They wore the uniform of oppressors, yet acted as protectors. They followed orders in form, while subverting them in spirit. Each day presented new moral challenges, but also opportunities to assert humanity in a world dominated by cruelty. The network began to inspire subtle change among other soldiers. Observing Karl and his companions, some conscripts began to hesitate at the sight of civilians in danger, subtly aiding escapes or delaying executions. These small ripples of moral courage, though invisible to higher command, strengthened the network's influence and reach. In the dead of winter, the network faced its most perilous mission. Intelligence reported that partisans had captured a small German detachment, and reprisals were expected against nearby villages. The network devised a complex plan: stage delays, manipulate reports, guide civilians to safety, and create diversions to prevent mass killings. The operation unfolded over several nights. Karl coordinated movements and timing. Heinrich managed diversions and escape routes. Fischer guided villagers to hidden shelters, and Franz provided medical assistance. The plan required flawless execution, and the network's trust in one another was absolute. Despite the danger, the operation succeeded. Civilians were protected, prisoners escaped capture, and officers were misled. The moral victory was profound, though the threat of exposure lingered. Karl understood that their actions, though small in the grand scope of the war, represented acts of humanity and courage in the midst of atrocity. By spring, the network had become highly skilled in navigating the delicate balance between obedience and conscience. They had saved countless lives, influenced fellow soldiers, and preserved fragments of humanity in a brutal landscape. Yet Karl and his companions knew that the risk of discovery remained ever present. Every new assignment, every officer inspection, and every unforeseen event could unravel months of careful planning. Karl often wrote letters to his family in Munich, not detailing the acts of defiance, but reflecting on courage, conscience, and the responsibility to act morally even when surrounded by violence. These letters were a personal record of the network's moral struggle and a reminder of the principles guiding them. The men who walked away from mass murder had discovered that bravery did not always require heroics, that conscience could survive even under extreme duress, and that careful planning, trust, and moral clarity could turn ordinary soldiers into protectors of life. They understood that each life preserved, each small act of defiance, was a victory against the machinery of war. Though the winter snows melted and spring approached, the network's vigilance never waned. Each day brought new challenges, but also opportunities to assert humanity. Karl Reinhardt and his companions had learned that moral courage could endure even in the darkest circumstances, that the quiet defiance of a few could save hundreds, and that walking away from mass murder was an act of extraordinary courage.